Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Talking About the Big Stuff podcast with Michael Cole and Matthew Cravat. I am Michael Cole.
And I am Matthew Cravat.
Yes.
There are things that pop out of my mouth without me consciously thinking about it.
Yep. All right. Tonight, let me explain where I came up with
There's not enough time to explain.
Where I came from, where the concept for tonight's topic came from. I listened to today's GAM for people non-familiar. That's God awful movies. They take different movies, typically with a religious bent, although sometimes not necessarily. But
sometimes it's pseudoscience.
Yeah,
like
and they take those and they make fun of them. I don't typically listen when it is movies that are narrative or not narrative, but like acted out. I only listen when it's documentaries specifically, because you don't really need to know as much about that.
Listening to them make fun of someone's acting ability when you haven't seen the acting is kind of
exactly. And a lot of times the documentaries, you're familiar with some of the people that are in it. So this was,
or at least the arguments they're making are not new. So
yeah. So this one was they were talking about Matt Walsh's "What Is a Woman." I do recommend that episode of GAM because I think they did a great job. And I haven't watched "What Is a Woman." I will not watch "What Is a Woman," but it was a good episode. Anyway, the reason that I bring that up is in the episode they were talking about Matt. What the hell's the guy's name? Did I just say it?
You said Walsh a minute ago.
Matt Walsh, yes, not the one from Second City or whatever, or the Groundlings or whatever. You know, there's the internet going crazy about the good Matt Walsh and the bad Matt Walsh.
In their description on the podcast, because I'm downloading the episode, it says, this week we have a brand new guest masochist, Trinity Pixie, for a review of What Is a Woman, Matt Walsh's Bigot Mentory, produced by the Daily Wire. So it's Bigot Mentory.
Yeah. So in the episode, they're talking about Matt Walsh getting kind of upset or talking about, you know, he has a very regimented way of thinking about men and women, and some of that he thinks is biblically backed, and some of that he thinks is scientifically backed. But then there's also this like just weird. There's all the like all the pieces of gender and maybe more specifically sex that are more sociological, I guess, than religious and or scientific. And one of those things that they mentioned in the episode was emotions. So they and I used to get frustrated because I knew people that would do this. It tends to be men. There is a tendency to refer to women as being emotional, when the reason why a lot of these men are able to make that claim is that they don't recognize certain male emotions or certain emotions that they would recognize that they have, but they wouldn't recognize them as emotions. So they're not male emotions. The one that's most specifically that I think of is anger. That everyone has anger. If you don't,
no, I don't.
There's a problem. But if you have too much, it's a problem. If you have none, there's a problem. But the point being, anger.
So we learned that from the Turnabout Intruder episode of original Star Trek, when Kirk was split in half, that his gentle emotions and his aggressive emotions, and neither one was functional without the other.
Gotcha.
Go back and watch your Star Trek, everybody.
Yeah. So anyway, the anger is this thing that guys will literally, and you know, obviously this is not all guys, but it is very much the Matt Walshes of the world. And then
not all guys.
And some guys who I think are genuinely like not problematic and near, you know, just guys that I would say are somewhat standard guys, have this tendency to believe women are more emotional, and if they realized that anger was an emotion, and you were to like calculate, okay, you expressed emotion 47 individual minutes of today while you were awake, and I expressed anger 36 minutes, and then I was sad afterwards for 9 minutes. The guys are counting 9 minutes, not 46 minutes, or I think I did that math wrong, but you get the point. And so, to me, I think that's an interesting. Like, first, I think obviously, I think I'm very. I think I'm very in tune with my emotions. I think I'm very open about it. I tend maybe to have a delay on being able to recognize my emotions. Sometimes it takes me a few minutes to like be like, oh, like, I'm this is where I'm at, but I'm not like in denial. Like I'm not going to be like if I yelled at you right now and you were next week we were talking about it and you're like, well, you were yelling at me, you were clearly mad at me. I'd be like, there's not many times where I'd be
I
like,
wouldn't
no.
say that. I would say, you know what you did. Oh, you know why I'm angry with you. You know.
All right, see, Matthew's going to be he's going to be playing the role of the misogynist in this episode.
Why did you assume that was misogyny? Where's your brain going to?
I assumed that you were mocking the stereotype of a woman or a wife.
Apparently you think woman and wife when you say that. I just think anyone who's passive aggressive. You are such a sexist pig.
Okay, he's going to be playing just the heel in general in this episode. So anyway, I've spoken quite a bit. Why don't you tell me what you think?
I don't disagree with anything you said, but I would add that the men of whom you speak, who don't want to acknowledge that they have emotions or who think that women have more, the key thing that I think a word you said in passing there was expressed, and I think that's what a lot of them hook onto.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't think they quote unquote have emotions because they don't express them.
Yeah,
they act on them.
Right.
So all the dude bros who are right now, to place this podcast in a moment in time, going on Rotten Tomatoes and slamming the Marvels movie because it's about 3 women and 2 of them are of color. So the guys who are slamming that, it's purely an emotional act.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it because their emotions about women and their emotions about people of color, and they're not screaming and yelling and ranting. They're very calm. They're like, oh, I'm going to do this. They may be even laughing about what they're doing. And so they don't recognize what they're doing as an emotional act
mm-hmm.
because they're not expressing emotion while they're doing it, but they're totally motivated by emotion. And what they're doing is completely an emotional act, but they wouldn't recognize it as such because they're like, no, it would be emotion if I was screaming while I did it.
Right.
And that's kind of where they draw the line sometimes. That could you tell they had the emotion?
Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, guys, I think that are more willing than to express joy than they are. It's I would say a lot of what we see is anger is fairly obvious, and I think joy can be like, especially like we're in a time where guys get really big about whatever people get really like big into whatever. So you're a big football person and your team wins and you show joy, and I don't think that, but I think that's just excitement, and like they don't see that as an emotion either. It has to be like emotion. The term they've given a connotation where it's kind of it emotional is weepy, and that is like it's do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. If it's a negative emotion in their eyes, that's emotional. If it's a emotion that basically, if it's an emotion they don't generally express, it's negative. If it's one they generally express, it's positive.
But I also just don't know that they would even recognize like that getting excited in a good way at for me Star Wars, if the new Star Wars came out, or actually the end the last episode of Loki, I was very happy about. But happiness is an emotion, but I don't know that those people that call women emotional or call or who vilify emotions would recognize that as emotions. And I don't know that it is always gender based, although I do think there's a lot of that. And I think that when someone is into, we see that all the time. If a man is more in tune with non-anger, non-joy, the emotions that they are in tune with sadness or vulnerability or any of those other things, that becomes feminine, and that's where we fight.
And touching my feminine side because I had an emotion.
Yes, yeah. As opposed to just like, oh, I'm a human being who feels things. To me, it's crazy to have, you know, have that, to be having that this conversation, like the fact that and I do think that there's a lot of men, and I'm sure there's women doing it too. Like I can think of one example, but I'm sure there's women and men both doing it. But to think that there's a lot of these people, and I don't think that they are what you or I or most people would consider typical misogynists. They're not, or jerks or anything else. They're just people who aren't necessarily like thinking about it. So this isn't, obviously Matt Walsh is an obvious answer to give as an example, but you don't have to be Matt Walsh. Like you could be
all
your
those
average
dude bros who are writing bad reviews for a women-led movie just because it's women-led.
Yeah, but I would say there's probably some who are there's probably some guys who in some ways are relatively feminist or relatively woke who just can't connect with this concept.
Yeah.
I think
there's a term I was Googling furiously, ignoring you, not ignoring you, half listening and half Googling, because I can't remember the damn term. And as you and I went to a philosophy speech 2 weeks ago, the philosopher mentioned it, the ethicist, I guess, in his talk, and it's that the phenomena of when you cut me off in traffic, it's because you're an asshole. When I cut someone off, it's because I'm in a hurry and it's justified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a name for that, where you hold yourself to a different standard than you hold everybody else to.
Yeah.
And I think that plays into a bit of this, right? Is that when I have the emotions, they're okay. I don't even notice them.
That is
true. When someone else has them, they're being emotional.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm justified in being angry because look what happened. My team lost. Yeah. You're being angry just because someone punched you. Come on, what the hell?
Right, and I think that if you're one of those people who would do this, would say you're being emotional. Typically, it's around some kind of sad emotion or depressed emotion or something like that. Something, like I said before, weepy kind of emotion. And you might be like, let's say I'm calling you emotional right now. You might be sad, weepy, upset, whatever the case may be, because you just had a stressful day, and you just like, that is the way to let that stress out, right? I may only feel that face that you're making right now when my grandmother dies, and when and that's, and not that expression. And I meant anyway. But my point being, like, so for me, that emotion is reserved for a massive deal, and for you, that emotion may be, this is the way, because I like. We like a good cry sometimes.
You don't even need the extreme. Sometimes it's like, it's like the guy cutting you off thing.
Yeah.
If I'm not feeling the emotion, then it's not justified for you to be that emotional about it. But the same thing could happen to me, and I feel it. And in that case, it is because I can feel it. I can't feel it when you're going through it, so I don't value it.
Yeah. No, I definitely. Well, that's a lack of empathy.
Like you don't. Yeah, but I mean, no, but I mean, it's not the empathy. Well, I mean, part of it may be empathy, but it's part of it is just the justification that, that to me, a level 6 on the sadness scale is worth expressing if it's me. But if you express it on a level 6, come on, suck it up. There's no reason for you to express it, because again, it's justified when I do it. It's not justified when you do it, because the world is about me, not about you.
Yeah, you've heard the thing, and maybe we've even talked about it on the podcast, but the idea that no two people, or that there's a possibility that none of us see colors the same way.
Yeah, my brother and I had that conversation when I was like 6.
Yeah, and
I didn't even get stoned to have that one.
Well, yeah, I think that emotions are relatively similar. I would imagine. Like, I don't know that when
someone sees the way you're acting when you're a child, tells you that emotion is called this, and so it is.
Yeah, the only difference is that there are certain physiological things that may come with emotions: crying, heart racing.
Yeah.
But like, other than that,
like with orgasms too. No, so I think but I think that there is definitely
what's an
things
orgasm?
That you and your wife asked the same question.
Sarah's gonna be like, why do I keep getting brought up? No, she'll think that's funny.
So anyway, I think, I think to your point of the physiological changes, that there are, I would venture to say, in my estimation, and I'm not an expert of the universe, there are clear cut. This emotion is this. This emotion is this. This emotion is it. And I think that when you're in a healthier, balanced place emotionally, you properly identify most of those when they're occurring to you.
Yeah.
But I think there are people who do not know how to properly identify like when they should be feeling sad, they get angry.
Yeah.
Like because they don't know how to process some of the emotions, that they process the wrong ones.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of that comes down to what was acceptable, and I mean, like, I'm lucky I did not really have parents who really like pushed on me the boys don't cry thing. I never had that. I mean, I cried
Well,
too.
my father, I had the "you want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about."
I did hear that.
I had reasons to cry.
I did hear that. I don't need a reason to cry. I'm already crying. I forget who it was. That Patton Oswalt that said that.
It could be. I don't know.
But yeah. But they I mean, I would say that I was a overly emotional child. I cried on the drop of a hat.
Man, look, the hat fell.
Yeah, and so I think that my parents were frustrated with my crying, but that wasn't. They never made me feel like boys don't cry. It was more just like nobody should cry this much.
It's not a gender thing. It's just
and now, as a parent of somebody who cries really fucking easy, I can say, "Oh, okay." And Sarah is the same way. Like Sarah was the same way as a kid, and she's like, "Oh yeah, like this is a lot." Like,
oh, so he got it. He got it honestly from both sides, genetically.
Yeah, yep. So,
I'm very my hippie parents were expression of emotion was valued. My dad sang songs that he couldn't sing in concert for the first couple of months after he learned them because he would cry singing the song too much. Till he got through the song enough where it wasn't touching anymore. When he was performing it.
I don't know if I've told this story on the podcast. I probably have told you the story, but I'm going to tell it. And so you're aware, Sarah nearly died when Logan was a week after Logan was born. She had an infection in a C-section incision, and a week to the day after Logan was born, we went to the emergency room. They kept her for another week. She was in surgeries all week. She had, it was a major problem. And during that time, I was going to the hospital during the day, and Sarah's mother stayed with Sarah, and I would go and spend the day with them, and try to work through. Sarah was not super conscious through the first 4 days or so. So Sarah's mother and I were we were taking notes on all the medical stuff that we needed her to know, and we were doing all that stuff together. And then I would go home so that I could help with Logan, because my mom and my sister, and then my aunts, my grandfather, and a couple other people were taking care of Logan, because Logan was not allowed to go to the hospital because of where Sarah was in the hospital, because he was a week
baby.
old.
You can't be exposed to everything. Yeah.
So we went back, and I was going back and forth, and
he won't stop crying.
And I was exhausted, like at a level of exhaustion that I've really never experienced since. And so, in order to keep myself awake while driving, I would put the radio on. But I wasn't putting on music that I knew, because I just felt so shitty that I didn't want to be
associate a song that
I didn't want to. Well, I didn't want to be like, if I can't do it, homie, it can't be done. So I just was like, no, I'm not. I'm going to just turn on the radio. Now, as we all know, anybody that grew up with the radio as like an actual radio, is that they play a lot of the same shit. And if a song is popular, they play it over and over and over again during a period. So the song that I heard every single morning on my way to the hospital that entire week was the song 7 Years by Lucas Graham. Are you familiar with the song?
No, but my sister wrote a song called 7 Years, and I'm like, why would they be playing her song? It never got airplay on other than a couple of folk music stations.
No. So the song, the song tells it's basically about a guy telling the story of like how when I was 7 years old, my father told me, go and find yourself a wife or you'll be lonely. And every verse is a different, it jumps forward a bit.
I was 14, I was 21.
But it wasn't always 7, but it was, when I was,
I hate that song then.
And then he was like, I was 62, my father got now I'm 62, my father got 61 or whatever, and it's all about life and death and about like getting all that stuff. And so it was very apropos of what I'm experiencing.
Here's a entire life experience growing old with someone in your
Yeah.
hospital.
So I never listened to the song. I never would put, like, after that week, Sarah comes back.
Probably why I've never heard it, because you don't listen to it.
We have a happy life, and then at the beginning of COVID, Logan is watching YouTube, and he finds Fortnite music videos, and these were videos where they would just put a song over people playing Fortnite, and so Logan thinks of those songs as Fortnite songs, and he's watching it one day, and Fortnite's going on, and it's once when I was 7, and I'm sitting on the couch, and I start crying, like wildly crying, and I'm just like weeping. And Logan, for weeks, because we were at that point, we were seeing our neighbors because we were all kind of quarantining together. We'd go out into the cul-de-sac and have drinks, and Logan would go out and be like, my dad cries at the Fortnite song, and like he would tell anybody that listens to it, and I'm like, it's not a Fortnite song. And he would just tell everybody,
it's Christmas shoes.
And after the first time he saw me weep, he played it again the next day, and he watched me to see, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna cry every time you play the song. I think now when I hear it, I don't cry as much because he did it so much. But for a while, it was like my trigger song because it was so emotional.
Occasionally, he'll ring a bell to see if I drool.
Yeah, and I would try to explain that to him, that like this is like what happened with the kid-friendly version, and so he would.
You almost killed your mom.
It was not his fault. First of all,
I didn't say it was his fault. I did not apply fault. I just stated a fact.
Well, he didn't almost kill her. It was
come on. He came out with a damn switchblade. He was like jabbing everywhere.
I'm here. Here's Logie.
It's the thing. You do not watch Forged in Fire while you're pregnant. Everyone knows that.
We actually watched Damien.
Nothing called Damien. It's called The Omen. Thank you very much.
Whatever. I haven't seen it.
Damien's just the kid's name.
I haven't seen The Omen. I need to. I was listening to a podcast about. So I've been listening to this podcast about the top 100 movies from Cinefix, and they were talking about The Exorcist, and one of the guys goes, "I prefer The Omen. I just think it's better."
No, they're both really good movies. Yeah. The Omen is not as gory, bloody, jump scary. It's more weird and eerie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
and it's like part one of at least is it 6 movies? I mean, like it was made as a standalone movie, but it's just the beginning of the story. So you can watch the other movies. Omen 2 is really good too. I think after that they dropped off. Like after that, it probably wasn't the same creative team anymore. It was just people, the studio hiring someone to make the sequels, and it wasn't the same.
Yeah. I might call this episode "My Dad Cries at the Fortnite Song."
Yeah. My sister's song 7 Years is completely different.
Good.
It's about a pioneer woman who Indians, Native Americans, tribal people raid while her husband's on a business trip, and she gets kidnapped. And cut to 7 years later, she's given birth to 2 children by her kidnapper. She's part of his property, and they're traveling somewhere, and in the bushes she sees her husband watching from the bushes, and she's singing to him, "It's been 7 years that I haven't spoken English, 7 years that I've been his. Where have you been all this time?" And then she sees him turn and leave rather than confront to get her back.
Nice.
It's a real happy song.
Yeah. I'm sending you the version of 7 Years that I know.
Okay, I'll send you mine afterwards.
Go ahead. I'll listen to it.
Leah does a really good rendition of it, actually.
Yeah. Music does it a lot for me. Music triggers a lot. And there's a song that I heard when I was staying with my dad in June. I went to Sarah's sister's house to let the dogs out one day. And I was driving, and this song comes on, and it's the guy wrote the song when he found out his dad was going to die. And I was just driving around Massachusetts, just sobbing. Okay, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Nothing. I just purposely did not say who let the dogs out.
Oh, me. You know that song is about women? I did not know that.
I just know the chorus. So
No, like that line is about ugly women. I did. Someone told me that recently.
Now, my friend Danny wrote that song.
Did he?
He wrote "Ugly Women." It was a satire of people who were talking about guys who were talking about the satire of men who don't like women's lib. And it was their viewpoint that ugly women want to liberate my wife. Ugly women want to steal my girl. Ugly women want to run my life. Ugly women want to rule the world. It was an anti-women lib song, but it was sarcastically anti-women.
Yeah.
I mean, all the women in my mother's friend group would sing it at the top of their lungs at concerts. It was laughter.
I wish I had friends. Must be nice. Orgasms and friends.
Not always.
What are those things?
Two things I don't understand.
Yeah.
You know, both of them you can be for yourself. So.
Yeah. All right. Do you think there's any other emotions other than
Undiscovered country of emotions?
I was gonna say other than anger and possibly joy that men seem to exhibit, or people who would accuse others of being emotional?
I mean, I think there's. I mean, obviously, fear and anxiety.
Fear is a good one.
Big ones, and I think they're also the kind that get expressed by some men as anger because they would see them as weakness, where anger is not seen as weakness; it's seen as a strength to them. So they get angry when they're afraid rather than be afraid.
Yeah.
Or rather than express fear, I should say.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to like the old thing where you talk about homophobia, and it's not a phobia. I just hate them. Like, and there is like a truth to that of like that line is real thin, and I think it's that same mental gymnastics.
Whenever someone says, "Well, the root of the word," that's not how English works, though. Yeah. I know that's how you do your SAT to try to figure out a word, but in English, half the words don't, because otherwise, regardless and irregardless would be opposites, and they're not opposites. So that's not how English works.
Isn't irregardless not a real word?
No, it's perfectly a real word. People just get mad that it's a real word because it should be the opposite of regardless. Because like ir doesn't do anything, so people get mad about it. But that's how our language works. The way you use it becomes real.
This is a real frustration that I have. When you have an
emotion, you got an emotion going on. It's frustration,
and I will 100% own that.
Own that.
When you buy a can of olives, they come
never happen.
Okay, I like olives. They come pitted, which means that the pit has been removed. That should be de-pitted. It should not be pitted. Pitted is when they have the pit. But
well, like I would say, it's like funny if you sell someone, get me boned chicken thighs. Wait, when you say boned, do you mean that the bones have been removed, or do you mean you want the bone there because you want it boned? Wait,
or do you fuck the chicken thighs?
I know that's disgusting because that's what mashed potatoes are for. Ew. Yeah, but it's like clearly the correct word. It means take it out.
Yeah,
but you're right. Deboned would be much more clear. It's like de-pitted.
I tried. Sarah and I, like, this was years and years ago. I asked her if they were pitted. I forget. It came up, and I said to her, "Why would it be that?" And she's like, "That's what they call them." And she showed me on the can. She's right. They're called pitted when the pit is removed. And her mother was there. Her mother was like, "Michael's right. That makes no fucking sense."
No, it's consistent with other things.
Yeah.
I mean, how many ways are there to skin a cat? When you say that, you mean remove the skin from a cat, not put more skin on, right? You don't mean de-skin a cat.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of things that we when you skin something, you're taking the skin off it.
Yeah. So when you're coming, it is going.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
What I find interesting.
Sure.
When women say that looking for a romantic partner, a sense of humor is important. What do you think they mean?
I think they want someone that's funny.
When a man says looking for women, a sense of humor is important, what do you think they mean?
They want somebody who understands the way that they joke.
Who thinks they're funny, yeah.
So it's funny because I think that I always think of a sense of humor the way a man would refer to a woman as having. But I think that that is a pretty big divide, and I always think like No, there's plenty of people who are funny that don't have a good like my parents. My mom is not remotely funny, but she has a great sense of humor because she thinks lots of shit is funny. As long as you don't joke about the Catholic Church, she thinks it's all funny. My dad is hilarious, but doesn't always have a good sense of humor. He kind of can get.
So my comedy group, we used to talk about this, and we'd say we think there's be a different phrase for that. Your mother has an appreciation for humor. She doesn't have the sense of when something can be funny and how to make it funny and how to tweak it, like Peter Parker has Spidey sense. She has an appreciation of humor, where your dad, or some people don't. Like some people just don't get a joke; they don't have an appreciation of humor. But they don't. But the sense of humor is the ability to make it funny and see where the humor is, sense where the humor is in a situation. That was our definition. I mean, it's not an official one. I'm not saying that's what it is in the world, but like we wish there were two different ways to say it.
I agree.
So it's not like it means the same thing.
I agree that there should be two different ways. I don't know that I think of it that way. I think of it obviously backwards from what you just said, but I do think there needs to be a second option. And I always just did, you're funny and you have a sense of humor.
What do you mean I'm funny? I mean, like
Funny
a
how?
clown? Like I amuse you? Like the things I say are funny to you?
Oh my God. I heard it was a clip of Jay Moore on YouTube yesterday, and he was doing Adam Sandler as Joe Pesci in that exact scene. And he was like, oh, how do you think I'm funny? I'm so funny, I'll take it. And he was just doing the impression, and oh my God, I have something funny to tell you, and it will be for patrons. But anyway, but yeah, he does a good impression of he's a very good impressionist, and he's
one of the more underappreciated. Like when he was on SNL, he pioneered a lot of expressions that became standards for other people, and he did them first.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was one of the first walk-ins.
He's one of the best walk-ins too, and he does in that same clip. It was a bunch of his impressions, and he says that everyone thinks Kevin Pollak does the best walk-in, but Kevin Pollak has too much of a cadence. And he's like, my walk-in kind of could just randomly, and like I don't do a good walk-in, obviously, but he was like, there is no cadence to it. There's no way to guess how I'm going to do it.
So have you ever seen the clip of David Grohl talking about when they were Foo Fighters was on SNL with Christopher Walken as host?
Yeah.
Christopher Walken goes backstage.
Foo Fighters?
Where do you put the accent in Foo Fighters? We put it on fight. Ladies and gentlemen, Foo Fighters.
Well, and they had him do it a week ago because he was on the show randomly for another sketch, and the Foo Fighters were the musical guest. So instead of having whoever the guest was on that episode, they had Christopher Walken do the.
He's part of their lore now.
Yeah, Foo Fighters, our patrons. Sarah's gonna be like, "Did you just do Adam Sandler playing with your nipples?" She's downstairs. So she's hearing some of what we're doing right now.
Playing the greats. He's hitting all his high spots.
Yeah.
The reason I married that man is Adam Sandler nipple impersonation.
Yeah. Yep. I was talking today at work about sorry, the dogs are going fucking nuts.
Well, who let the dogs in?
Yeah. I was talking today at work about somebody brought up that they just saw Gone Girl for the first time, and we started talking about how they advertise that as a date movie, and all, we started talking about like weird first dates, and I said my first date with Sarah, we went on a date, and we went to have lunch because we both worked evenings, so like a lunch date was better for us. I said I didn't remember any of this until like Sarah reminded me of this like a few years ago. So I now remember it, but I didn't really remember it until she said something. Our entire first date, I talked about time travel because there was a clip of somebody from Charlie Chaplin's The Circus DVD extras that looked like they were holding a cell phone. And I had seen an article explaining how that this is probably a time traveler. And I spent our entire that was the article said probably. I wasn't saying probably.
I know that's funny though. That's funny, but it's probably a time traveler.
Yeah,
not someone holding something else. Probably a time traveler.
Yeah, no, it was a conspiracy theory. But I spent almost our entire first date talking about that, and when she told me, like years later, she's brought it up, and I was like, "Why did you give me a second date?" She goes, "I thought you were cute. I thought it was cute. It was, or no, I thought it was sweet." And I was like, "What?" And then I was telling at work today, and I said, "I must have been really fucking hot."
Yeah, on our second date, not yours and I, but my wife and I,
Yeah.
I quoted Star Trek, and then I was like, and she just stared at me, and I was like, "Well, that's the last date," and
Yeah.
I was like, I'm sorry, that was Star Trek. I'm sorry, and she goes, "No, no, no," and then she said the next two lines that follow the quote.
Nice.
Like, and her look was, "Oh my god, I found a Star Trek fan," because her previous boyfriend hated Star Trek. So, what I misread as horror was turned on by Star Trek quotes.
Yeah.
And we actually spent we sat next to each other in class that semester, and we met in class, and we would write Star Trek quotes to each other, and the other person had to write what character said it and what episode it was from. And of course, this is original series because there was no other Star Trek.
That was the question I was just about to ask, because
the
you guys
animated. Yeah, we were dating a year and a half before Next Generation premiered.
Gotcha. I have yet to see any of the movies. I've watched some of the original series, maybe 5 or 6 episodes of the first season. I watched a bunch of, when I was a kid, I watched a bunch of Next Generation until there was an episode where Picard meets the devil, and it scared me, and I couldn't
Ardra.
sleep.
Her name is Ardra.
I don't remember that, but
her name was Ardra.
okay,
I
believe you. But I was so scared because I was like Logan's age or younger, and I couldn't sleep. And my parents were like, "You're not watching fucking Star Trek anymore." I'm like the one person who was afraid of Star Trek. So,
well, it's like the joke that, or the joke made up, right? But in England, Doctor Who is a kids and adult show, but a lot of the episodes are pretty scary. So the joke is that kids watch it from behind the couch, like that's where kids grow up watching Doctor Who. And when Madhavi and I, when the new Doctor Who started, Madhavi and I were watching it, and one day we heard a noise behind us, and we looked, and Jacob was behind the couch watching it. Like, he would sneak down and watch it when we watched it. We didn't know. Like, the third or fourth time he had snuck down to watch Doctor Who behind us. So we were like, "No, you can watch it." And then we let Joseph watch, and Leah was like 2 or 3 or whatever. When Doctor Who come back on 2005, yeah, she was like 3. So she started watching it as long as she could remember. She doesn't remember a time when she didn't watch Doctor Who.
my behind the couch show, you're gonna be like, "What the fuck?" But no, you'll probably think this is awesome. In living color, my mom would watch it, and I think my dad watched a little bit of it. But
I was a little afraid of all the black people, but if I stayed behind the couch, I was okay.
No, I was behind the couch because they thought I was asleep, and they wouldn't have let me watch it, not because of the black people, because the content was not appropriate for a 5-year-old.
The Fly Girls.
Yeah, not the Fly Girls so much as like
the entire nature of the show was adult show. It was definitely adult show. I jest. Except for Kyle Marshall Bill was preschool humor. That might as well have been Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah. Let me tell you something. So you're standing in a bucket of gasoline and you're smoking a cigarette. I love Fire Marshal Bill. My favorite. And there's so many good ones. I remember, actually, the one that I wouldn't 100% think they would not have let me watch if they had known was Venus de Milo, or Vera de Milo, with the, she just had like the string. It was Jim Carrey as a female bodybuilder with just a string covering her nipples, and then they would rip it off, and she'd be like, "You've seen my breasts, or whatever. You must die." Yeah.
I don't. There was my parents' bedroom was at the top of like 4 steps. Like, our house was like similar to a townhouse design, the way it was in Brooklyn. But so there was a lower level, a middle level where like the kitchen, living room entrance was, and an upper level where my parents' bedroom, a side bedroom, whatever. And there was like 5 or 6 steps going up there. And I remember there were shows at night that I would sit on those steps and watch my parents watch the show. And I don't remember which shows they were, but I know that they were like primetime shows that weren't appropriate for me necessarily. Probably not inappropriate, they just weren't kid shows. So
it was probably like Jewish guys fucking black women, probably. Like,
it was the life and times of Sammy Davis Jr., so yes, he was a Jewish guy.
Yeah,
you're 100% correct.
Hey, I gotta have at least one running joke about your parents. It's not nearly as bad.
Use that. Go with that.
Your parents are so cool that
when there was a time in college where, for a biology class, me and a bunch of classmates had to go up to the Museum of Natural History in New York and like take notes on certain things, whatever. And on the way back, I was like, "Hey guys, I'm going to stop at my mother's office to go to lunch with my mother. Like we did it, like we went early in the morning, and anyone want to come?" So like 3 or 4 people said, "Yeah, we'll go meet your mom." So we met. My mom went to a Mexican restaurant, and she got the biggest fucking margarita, like the fishbowl kind, and she was so drunk. And like it's funny because as we were going to the table, 2 of my friends were over 21, and one of them ordered a drink, and the other one was like horrified that he would order a drink in front of my mom. And then she got this huge margarita, got so drunk, and she was like, literally, like we had to help walk her back to her office.
Nice.
That's my mom.
I got when I turned 21, I worked at a Home Depot, and it was right next to a Ruby Tuesdays, and so I went to Ruby Tuesdays for lunch, and got what at the time they had. I don't think they sell it anymore. Called a Megarita, and it was 32 ounces of margarita. Then I went over and worked at like 1 o'clock at Home Depot.
Yeah, the most I ever had was 1 or 2 beers at lunch at work. When I used to work at like a video store, and a fraternity brother of mine waited tables at the restaurant right across the parking lot, and occasionally he would bartend. And so he'd call me when he was bartending during the day, and I'd go and eat lunch sitting at the bar, and he would just pour me a beer without noting it anywhere, because we were just sitting at the bar. So I'd have like 2 beers during lunch. So I'd go back slightly with a little bit of a college buzz, but only barely. Nothing that would impair my work.
Yeah, I was a cashier, so I wasn't like dealing with heavy machinery, but
yeah, I had to rewind videos sometimes.
Yeah.
Actually, our store asks people not to rewind videos. We like to give videos out, not rewound. The theory being, and I don't know if there's any validity to this, that when you rewind it in your machine, it tracks it better to your head, so you get a better view of it. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that's what we told people.
I like getting ahead. Yeah. But where else could what else is going?
I don't know, but I get really emotional and I get tears in my eyes. I'll tell you that much. My favorite thing is they use banana as perfect, obviously designed by God because it's got such a good thick rind to protect it. And but bananas are like the most
genetically
cultivated crop to make it the way it is. Like,
I mean, literally, like if they did the puddle thing,
worst example.
If they did the puddle thing, it would be, like, oh, look, the water is perfectly formed for this puddle. Yeah. They could not pick a more atheist-friendly argument for that than a banana.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah. And that makes me happy, which is an emotion.
Yeah.
I'm going to be cutting all these little snippets out, although we got a good amount for. I'm going to be cutting these snippets out and just leaving in and that's an emotion, and that's an emotion. But I
second that emotion.
I cut together I edited our last episode, and I haven't exported the regular feed yet, but it's like 35 minutes after we cut all the shit out of it. So, I do think we have enough. You think we should wrap up because
one of us is losing internet because I'm losing images of you. I don't know if it's me or you, but we should probably wrap up before one of us disappears.
It's probably me. Our internet sucks. All right, so. And it's that time again for me to stumble fuck my way through the.
You just need to record it in like isolation and just tag it on.
Yeah, I'm gonna. I keep thinking that, but I also like the idea of just having it be part of the thing and doing it every time. If you're watching us on YouTube and you can see our faces, please hit the like, subscribe, ring the bell so you get notifications. Watch all the videos all the way through if you want. Like that's
share with your friends.
Share with your friends.
Share with your enemies.
Share with your enemies.
Share with anyone.
If someone tells you you're too emotional and you want to tell them to go fuck themselves, share this episode. No, if you're trying to inform somebody, that's like I like to share stuff like that. If you're listening to us on iTunes and you would like to be part of that patron feed that we talk about, the $3 one, not the $10 one, you can hit subscribe. And that will, it'll set you up to get the $3 feed. If you want to get the $10 feed, you do have to go to Patreon, which you can get both the $10 or the $3 feed at. That's patreon.com/talking about the big stuff. And if you are on iTunes or anything else, hit a like or give us a review. Anything that would express that you like the podcast, and depending on your app, you know what it is. So,
and if you're not on iTunes, you can still go into iTunes just to review the podcast. You don't have to use it to listen to the podcast.
Yeah,
You can even
Absolutely.
listen to it on your home assistant just by calling out her name and saying, play the latest episode of Talking About the Big Stuff.
Absolutely. Or you could call out your home assistant and be like, "Hey, subscribe me and let me know when there's another episode." I don't know if
Dun,
it'll
dun,
do
dun,
that.
dun, dun.
Does it do that?
I don't know.
Should I just make that shit up?
You're the one who helped overthrow the
Yeah.
server farm.
Yep. And that is about it. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but I archived all the old videos. They're still available, but they're not like they're unlisted now, so you can still find them. You just go into like archive videos list. Anyway, do you got anything?
Nothing out of the ordinary.
No.
Just,
Hopefully,
I just will say, I don't know if I plugged this. I haven't plugged it in a long time, so I'll plug it now if I haven't plugged it in a long time. Is my brothers and I switched our hot sauce channel to more of just reviewing food and stuff, and it's just fun. It's goofy and it's fun. So if you look for Brooklyn Brothers Food Review, you can find us reviewing food. Sometimes it's restaurants, sometimes it's like devil dogs. We're just
yeah.
having fun.
Oh my god. Side note, real quick, is that at work we had little Twinkie. Like I guess they're probably regular Twinkies now, but they seem little. But they were individually wrapped, and they were
They're
in our
little because your boner's bigger than it used to be.
yeah. Well, that's how I measured. Now I'm 2 Twinkies long. No. um, we had them individually wrapped in our like free samples because we get samples of jerky and candy and a bunch of other shit that's not good for you. And I grabbed one and I was like, because it was the only thing there today. I was like, I could use a Twinkie sounds good. Bit into it. It was fucking pumpkin spice cream inside the Twinkie. I was so fucking grossed out.
That's great. I would probably not like to be surprised by pumpkin spice cream in my mouth. But if it
Could be
wasn't a
worse.
surprise, I would like it. I do like that flavor profile, but it's always weird to not expect the flavor that you get.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
yours,
I was just
Marcus.
expecting a normal Twinkie. Yep. All right. So.
So thanks everyone for joining us to talk about the big stuff. It makes me happy, and that's
An
an emotion.
The preceding podcast has been a Chocolate Diamond Media LLC production. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved.